In this module, I will be teaching you how to make a torso block. We're going to be using our bodice front block, our bodice back block, our skirt front block, and our skirt back block. And you'll notice we're using the single dart blocks for the front and back skirts. And at the end, what we will end up with is something that looks like this. So that's the front and this is the back. And you'll notice basically what happens is the upper bodice gets joined to the skirt so that you end up having an entire piece and we get rid of the waist. Now the reason that we might want to do something like this is so that we can have a really seamless line between the upper torso, like upper portion of the body, and the lower part of the body. So just for some examples really quick, I'm going to put some images up on the screen. The first image is of Nicole Kidman, and she's wearing Balenciaga from 2007 on the red carpet. The second image that you'll see in the middle is also Nicole Kidman on the red carpet. This one's from 1997 and it's from the Dior collection. And the final image is of Jennifer Lawrence in 2014, and she is also wearing Dior. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put some lines up on the screen showing the seam lines on each of these garments. And you'll notice there is no waist seam at all. So arguably these dresses were probably draped, but using a torso sloper or block, we can create these exact same dresses doing flat pattern as well. So that's why we're developing these blocks, is so that we can make evening wear like this, but you can also use the torso block to create down jackets that have no waistline seam. So basically, anytime you want to get rid of the waistline seam, you're gonna be using a torso block. So let's get into it. First thing I will show is that you have two options to do the bodice front. You can do a pivot method to move a dart, or you can do a slash and spread method. So I'll show you the slash and spread method first, and then I will show you the pivot method. So for the slash and spread method, you're going to need to transfer over the bodice front to another piece of paper and cut it out. The next thing you need to do is take your skirt front, and you are going to be measuring the opening of the dart from here to here. That spot right there. Measure that. Mine is 5/8 of an inch. Yours probably will be 5/8 of an inch as well, but in the future when you're working with a different block, it may very well be something completely different. So this is 5/8 of an inch, and when I stick these together, I would like the dart belonging to the bodice front to match the dart of the skirt front. So I need to decrease the size of the bodice, and to do that, I'm going to move part of this dart someplace else in the pattern. So for this activity, we're going to move it to a spot an inch down from the armhole. So I'm just going to make a little mark right here, an inch down from the armhole. And I'm going to connect that mark to my bust point. Now I can slash it open. You can use scissors, you can use an X-Acto blade, doesn't really matter how you do it. We just need to slash to, but not through the bust point, so that we can pivot this piece here. Now, I'm going to put this aside and get my final piece of paper ready. So here I have my final piece, and I'm going to have these pieces line up somewhere right here. So I'm going to create a long straight line on the right hand of the page. Now what I'm going to do is take my bodice front that I just created, and I am going to attach that. I'm going to stick it up fairly high on the paper so there's room for the skirt. I'm going to line up that center front line of my bodice with the line that I just drew. And I'm just going to tape that down so that it doesn't move. Now, I can measure from the dart leg that is closest to center front, I can measure over the distance that I got from my skirt front.
So from here, I will measure over 5/8 of an inch. Hopefully you can see that. There's a little mark right there that is 5/8 of an inch away from this dart leg, so that I can pivot this down until it matches. And I've moved a good chunk of the dart here over to the side seam, so that now the dart that is facing down will match up with my skirt front. These are now the same size. So this is how you slash and spread the dart over to a different location to get it down to the same size as the skirt front. Now I will show you how to do the pivot method. For the pivot method, I'm going to start with my big piece of paper with that long line drawn on the right side. And I'm going to take the bodice front, and I am going to identify that point down from the underarm, that inch down. I'm going to identify that point. And then I'm going to take my bodice front, stick it in place, and I'm going to begin tracing. First thing that I want is I want to get my bodice, my bust point right there. So I used an awl to create my bust point right there. Now I'm just going to mark the bottom of my dart leg and to trace around the bottom, up center front, across the neckline, shoulder, down. Make sure that you include your notch for the front. And I'm going to continue tracing down until that inch. It's going to make a little mark there. So I trace from here all the way around down to here. I have yet to trace this section here. This section, I'm going to pivot into place. So I'm going to have my awl sitting right there so that I can rotate my piece. But then I need to measure from this interior dart leg 5/8 of an inch and now I can pivot my piece till this other dart leg lines up with that 5/8 of an inch mark, and I can trace the rest of it. So I'm going to trace from that 1 inch mark down the side, across the front. Take out my awl, and I have finished tracing the front. I can now come in here and draw in all dart legs. I still have to perfect these dart legs, but we will do that at the end. So I'm just going to draw them in first. And we're ready to add the skirt. At this point, if you chose the slash and spread method or the pivot method, you will both get to this exact same point at this moment in these instructions. Once you have your bodice front traced and all of the darts placed where they need to be, I'm going to take a line, square over from center front. So here is my center front, and I'm going square over from center front at the level of the waist side seam. Right here. So I've shifted my paper. You don't have to do that, but I'm making a line from this point here, perfectly perpendicular to the center front line, like that. Once I've done that, I will take my skirt front and line up the waist side seam right here. I'm going to make sure that that also lines up with this line. Even if it's a little bit out or a little bit in, I'm going to make sure that it stays at that level. And I'm going to line the center front up of the skirt with the long line here. Once it looks like that, I can trace and transfer the skirt front over. Make sure you don't accidentally shift anything. Make sure all of your lines are also very crisp. It's important to keep our lines crisp. Other thing to remember is to transfer over your hip line. It's an important piece of information. So I'm going to fill in my hip. And I'll label that so I know what it is later. Hopefully I would know what that is later just by looking at it, but just in case. What you might notice is that there's an increase of fabric right here, an increase of paper between the top piece and the bottom piece. That's to be expected because we have lost the waistline seam. So we have lost one seam, which makes it a little bit harder to fit things perfectly. If we were to turn any of this into a princess seam later, we would be able to address this issue. But in order for us to have this complete torso block as is with this fisheye dart, we're going to have a little bit of extra fabric added. The other thing that can happen is once you have completed this pattern, you could do a muslin out of it and just check fit, make any alterations that you need to. In fact, that would be the ideal thing to do once you are done completing a pattern, is to always do a muslin to check the fit. Okay, once I have everything traced on, I can start perfecting everything. My hem's great, all of my side seams, all of that kind of stuff is great. The only issues that I see are right here. It isn't a perfect match, so I need to blend whatever one is out farther. In this case, the bodice is a little bit wider than the skirt, and I'm going to go with the widest measurement, not the smallest measurement, the widest measurement, and blend it in. So I blended from here down onto this hip curve. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the dart legs from the top and from the bottom. And I'm going to use the top ones down to the bottom, but then what I'm going to do is use the point of the base dart and redraw. If they don't perfectly match up, I'm going to redraw those points, those dart legs, to match where the extension of the bodice dart legs met my new hip line, waistline. So I'm going to draw new dart legs from the point of my skirt, the dart of the point of my skirt, up to that new waistline. Once that's done, I can label this as my waist. I can add my my grain line. I'm going to back the dart points away from bodice, the bust point. I'm going to back them away a 1/2 inch. To do that, I'm going to find the halfway point on the legs of the dart and draw a line down the middle of the dart. And along that line, measuring from the bust point, I'm going to back that point off a 1/2 inch and redraw my dart legs. I'm also going to do the same thing for the vertical dart. I'm going to connect the point of the top and the point of the bottom and just draw a nice straight line between them. And I'm going to move the point of the dart away from the bust point by 1/2 inch and fill in the rest of that fisheye dart again. At this point, you need to make sure that you have all of your labeling, so that includes any notches. So I'd make sure I really mark that underarm notch. I'm going to notch the waist, and I'm going to notch the hip. And I'm going to X out, or just little hashes, not big ones. I'm just going to hash out any of the lines that are no longer of use. Just little tiny hashes, nothing huge. Make sure you label it, and this is a bodice front. This is no longer the bodice front, this is the torso front. It's a size 8. and it is a half size. And you are done with the torso front. So now let's move on to the torso back. For the torso back, I'm going to take my piece of paper and I'm going to have a long line on the left side of the paper this time. For the front, we used the right. For the back, we're going to use the left. I'm going to grab my blocks for the skirt back and for the bodice back. And this time I don't have to transfer any darts or anything, so I can just take my bodice back and trace it over, lining up the center line with that long line that I created first. Once I have transferred the back, I can take my ruler and just like with the front of the torso, I'm going to take this outside corner and square over to center back. Then I'm going to take my skirt back. I'm going to take the side seam waist point right here, match it up with that line, match up my center back with the long line here, and I am going to trace it out. Make sure you remember your hip line. I did that on the front too, where I almost forgot it. Which just goes to show it's an easy point to forget. So I'm going to draw that hip line in. And this time, all I have to do is complete this area around the dart legs. And I'm going to use the bodice dart to determine the width of the final dart. This skirt dart is a little bit bigger than the bodice dart, and I don't want to use the bigger of the darts because if I take out too much, it might not fit. I would rather take in later than have to let out. So we're going to take the smaller. I'm going to take a line from the dart point on the bodice, and I am going to go straight down, perfectly perpendicular to that waistline that I drew in. And it should match up with the skirt's dart point. If it doesn't, move the skirt's dart point left or right to match up with that line. And then I'm going to make sure that the dart legs from the bodice are at the waistline. And I'm going to redraw the dart legs from the skirt to match the dart legs on the bodice. Once those are done, I'm going to check my side seam and make sure that that matches up as well. In this case, the skirt was a little bit wider than the bodice. That's often the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill in the missing information. So from the underarm, I'm going to draw a line straight down and blend to the new point here. So I went from here, just drew a straight line down to match up with the waist point side seam of the skirt. This way, I've never taken away fabric, I've only added fabric, and that can be addressed during a fitting. So this is the torso back. To finish it up, I'm going to add any of my labels, my grain line, make sure I've got my armhole notches. I'm going to label my center back. This is a size 8. It's a half size. And it is a torso back. Once you have completed a fitting, you can transfer these over to hard paper like this so that you end up with things that look like this. This is what it will ultimately look like. I'm not requiring that for this module, but ultimately, once a fitting is complete, you would transfer them over to a hard paper like this so that you have a block you can trace out later. That is how you create a torso front and a torso back.